My mouth wasn't working. Our agenda today should look pretty familiar. There's no surprises. We will start with why we are looking at this topic, then take a look at what others have to say about it, then go on to how our solution has been approached and implemented. Finally, we will get to the conclusion and some possible next steps. As more and more people are starting to return to the office, either full-time or on a hybrid schedule, the responsibility of making sure pets get their essential needs, such as foods, walks, and medicine, met on a consistent schedule is getting more challenging. This is especially true in multiple caregiver households. It's more than likely that at least once a day, someone is asking who fed or walked the dog today. Utilizing an online approach available to everyone in the household can provide the organization and support needed so our pets can have a consistent routine and never miss their walks or meals. The COVID pandemic meant a lot of changes for everyone, and that includes our pets. From one study, the biggest pet-focused concern noted during this time was behavioral issues due to changes in routine. Now that people are returning to work, the concern for pets is once again the stress due to another change in routine. And it may not even mean going back to the familiar routine from pre-COVID days, as many people may be transitioning to hybrid schedules where they only have to be in the physical office on a part-time basis. With all these changes in our lives, it can feel challenging just trying to remember what day it is, let alone keeping track of someone else's needs. Studies have shown that modern technology and applications can be successful in helping to manage caregiving tasks for humans. My project will be shifting that approach and using it for our pets. Communicating what needs to be done and who is responsible for getting it done is key to any successful project, and the same is true for successful management of our pet care. This application will track the needs and responsible owners for each task and will be accessible by everyone in the support group. Pets have always been a big part of my life and my friends' lives. They are our family, they make us laugh, and generally bring a lot of joy to our world. But I also know that they can be a source of stress, whether that be due to the issues of getting older or due to the changes in schedule as people are starting to return to the office or a more hybrid schedule. I hear the question get asked all the time now, who's taking the pup for his walk today? And I also hear about the frustration when somebody forgets. Daily management apps have been around for a while to help us stay on schedule, and newer apps are being trialed to help with the management of human caregiving. So why not an app for pet caregiving? Most people I talk to will tell you that their pets are part of their family. There may be some variation in where those pets fall in the order of family importance, but they are still family. One study noted that an estimated 60% of households includes pets, and those pets were commonly considered family. And a different study identified that dogs had become more integrated into the family in a humanized way, and were often perceived as members of the family. Not everyone has that same point of view, and some were sure to mention that they realized their dogs were not humans, but still it was not uncommon for the owners to refer to their relationship with their dog as similar to that with a child or grandchild. But being a pet owner or pet parent also comes with responsibilities, and as confirmed in one study, there's a lot more to being a pet owner than a lot of people had expected. And the pandemic made things even worse for some. 17% of the single respondents in one study said the responsibility of having a pet increased during COVID due to all the changes. And for owners of pets with chronic or terminal illness, the study showed that the higher the level of burden, the higher the perceived levels of stress, depression, and anxiety. A burden which came in significantly higher than what is considered significant for human caregiving. Having a single caregiver may mean there's less confusion around who is responsible for which pet caregiving tasks. But there's also no one around to remind that individual when it's time to do something, if you don't count the pet. And even if there are multiple caregivers, that does not ensure everything gets done. Westgarth's study on regular dog walking found that if there are multiple caregivers, that the motivation, intention, or feeling of responsibility was lower, and also that the perception that someone else can or will do it instead may be problematic for forming that intention. But they also found in that same study that forming schedules and routines that involve multiple household members can improve the consistency and number of regular dog walks. A human caregiving management app was trialed in a study by Oslock that evaluated the link between sharing human caregiving tasks with a support group and the productivity and health of the primary caregiver. What they found was that the primary caregiver received more assistance than they had without the app. And they also found that the probability of caregivers reporting doing more than half of all the caregiving tasks by themselves decreased by 9.1%. And the probability of caregivers reporting no one helping them in caregiving tasks also decreased by 7.9%. Results also showed that after the 6-week study, the primary caregiver was 9.1% less likely to spend more than 30 hours per week providing caregiving support, which resulted in feeling less overwhelmed. And finally, feedback from the study noted that the app made it easier to ask for help, which in turn resulted in them asking for help for things that they would not have otherwise asked. These studies support the proposition that formalizing schedules and routines can help improve the motivation and consistency for completing tasks. And they also show that management applications can have a positive effect on reducing caregiver stress and burden. The purpose of this project was to create an application that can reduce the stress and burden of managing the needs of our pets. This is accomplished through improved visibility and ownership of each task, plus an easy way to create and utilize a support group. Features include a main view that lists all scheduled tasks, which pet the task relates to, the due date, the status, the completion date, any notes, and then there are also links to create, edit, or delete the tasks. This feature list is very similar to the features listed for another app that I found you can get on your iPhone, but there are some significant differences, the obvious one being the platform. And I do think this type of app would be much more accessible as a mobile app, but in this case, I really wanted to utilize what we had learned in some of our classes and gain some more experience with web apps. Aside from that, though, I do think that this project has some advantage over the competition. Looking at the project goals of providing a simple way to have visibility and ownership over the schedule, there are some features that the competition just doesn't have, such as ownership for the tasks. It'll tell you who created the task, but it doesn't tell you who's responsible for completing it. There's no status information. It shows all tasks on the list, whether they're a year old or a day old and whether they've been done or not. And you also have to go to a separate task list for each pet. This project was built using the MERN stack. So it has React on the client side or front end for building the views, receiving any input, and controlling the component level reloads. It has Node and Express on the server side or back end to process the requests from React and manage any database input or output. And it has MongoDB as a database for storing any persistent data. In addition, several other dependencies are used. Fetch provides a simple way to work with HTTP requests and responses. Nodemon helps in the development stage by restarting the server whenever a change has been saved. Bootstrap provides pre-built code templates that are used for features such as buttons, forms, and tables. And Body Parser is used for breaking out the various pieces of information from a request body. Looking at the file structure for the project, you can see all of the components are broke out on the client side. These define what the user will see. They will take any input and send the request off to the server. And finally, they will control how the output is displayed. On the server side, we have server.js that will listen for requests. We have all of our API routes, and we have the configuration for the database connection. Put those all together, and you end up with a main view that will look like this. It does look like this. There are fields for task, pet, owner, due date, completion date, status, notes. There's links to edit or delete each task or to add a new task or user. And that's kind of it. So let's take a look at a demo. Whoops, or not. Here we go. So like I mentioned before, we do start off with a login page here. We hit submit, that takes us to our home page. So like I mentioned before, on our home page, we have all of the different fields. So what is a task? Which pet is it for? Who's the responsible owner for it? Due dates, close dates, current status. As you can see, these are all closed. Any particular notes you want to add. And then over to the side here, we have options to be able to, excuse me, edit or delete each record. And then at the top, we have options for adding new tasks or adding a user. And with all of the pages, except for there is no delete page, but for all of the other views, clicking on the logo over here in the upper left brings you back to this this home page, this landing view. So let's take a look at some of the options here. We can go in and let's say we want to add a new task. We just click up here. We're going to feed. Who are we going to feed? We're going to feed Tesla. And Stacy will be responsible for feeding Tesla. We're going to come over here to the calendar picker and we're going to say that's tomorrow. Stacy has to do that tomorrow. It's open. There's no completion, no notes yet. Just hit create task. And there we have it. You can see that Stacy is all set up to feed Tesla tomorrow. Now we can edit that and we can say that, you know, Tesla needs extra treats because Tesla always needs extra treats. So it takes us to our edit task page here, which again is pretty identical to the new task, except it pre-populates it with everything from the record. We hit edit task. Now, the other thing, like I mentioned with the edit page, if you hit edit page or all the others, again, if you go to this logo, it takes you right back. It doesn't make any changes. It takes you right back. And also delete does not take you anywhere, but will automatically delete the record. We can also add a user. And again, we've got the same thing, what you put in over here, just whatever name, username you want to put in, your user email. Yeah, create new user. It brings you right back to that page there. And if you take a look at Mongo, you can see that, refresh. You can also see that those records have been added into here. So that's it. I was going for something simple. I wanted everything in one place and just, you know, not a lot of extras at this point. So you can just get in, take a look at what needs to be done and get going. And that's it for that demo. So the onset of COVID plus the subsequent restrictions brought about significant changes in the routines of a lot of people. And in turn, that resulted in new routines for our pets as well. Now that restrictions are lifting, those schedules and routines are changing again. It's confusing for everyone, and even without COVID, as our pets get older and or have chronic or terminal illnesses, there's become a need for tools to help us manage our pets' day-to-day care. In addition, the studies show that most households own pets, and while those pets are generally considered as members of the family, they can also add additional stresses and burdens to the caregiver. Different studies and approaches have been tried to help ease the similar burden of human caregiving, and the study that comes closest to this project had an overwhelmingly positive impact. While I believe there's more that can be learned, I do believe that there is sufficient evidence that an application such as this one does have the potential to be an effective tool in managing the daily and long-term care of companion animals. And I also believe there is a large enough population of consumers that would feel they have a need for something to assist with their pet care management that the application could be financially viable. I think knowledge and skills are always a limitation when someone is learning, and this is definitely a new field for me. For this particular project, I found myself sometimes spending a lot of time researching features I wanted to add, only to find the answer, and it be something so incredibly simple that I don't know why it took so long to find the answer. And also when pulling information together from different sites that use different approaches, there were times I felt the code was kind of a mismatch of 3 different languages almost, because they had different structures to them. And so I had to try and connect the dots and make them all work together. So a lot of learning curve that just resulted in more time. Going forward, again, looking at the goal of making this as simple and user-friendly as possible, there are several features that I still want to add. The login logout feature is not fully developed yet. As you can see, the page is there, but it doesn't save the information yet into Mongo. I think the columns need to be sortable, and it would be nice to be able to specify what time each task is due and completed. There should be a way to schedule recurring tasks, since most pet care is reoccurring. And then the obvious thing would be to recreate this for a mobile app, because that's really what it needs to be for real use. So when I was researching this project, I did find reference to a couple of very similar ones, but they weren't active. So I think there still needs to be some research into how to track and improve engagement, just to sustain the product interest and keep the product viable. Some things that may help or hurt that I would take a look at with engagement, I'd like to study further, would be adding on-time metrics, maybe adding some type of point system and a leaderboard for competition or rewards or gold stars, something like that. And maybe add a social aspect, just something to make sure people keep coming back to the app. And that's it. Here's my key references. Thank you for your time. And are there any questions?
Thank you so much. Well, that's a good presentation.
Thank you for your presentation. I actually do have a question.
Of course.
It looks like it might be the case that anyone who uses the service can see all tasks for everyone.
That is correct.
Okay. Is limiting the visibility of tasks to specific users an option?
At this point, it's not, and I did consider that. What I didn't want, though, is if you're using this on a regular basis, I would want to see that there is a scheduled task for walking Tesla every night at 5, even if I'm not the one responsible for it, and that it's been completed. So I think if I were to move forward with that, maybe what I would do is hide the responsible person, unless it's the user that signed in. But to me, having that person listed, it kind of adds to the accountability. And I think that's kind of part of the studies that they found with the human caregiving, that really having somebody assigned to it saying, this is your job, you're responsible for it, and also having somewhat that peer pressure, I want to say, that accountability of everybody knows that you're responsible for it.
Okay, so thinking in terms of like, what if this scaled, the fundamental unit would be like the group of users that was keeping each other accountable, but only,
Absolutely.
Yeah, only that group would see those tasks.
Correct. Once I get the login connected up, you will only see for those pets, and for those users that are signed in for that. Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Are there any others?
Patrick, go ahead. Question.
Yes, I did have a quick question. Or actually, trying to think of a way to phrase it. Have you considered, for example, let's give an hypothetical where a pet wanders off and is lost, and then another registered user finds that pet wandering around the neighborhood. Have you considered any kind of feature that would allow you to, for example, take a picture of their collar or the serial number associated with that collar and do a messaging service to where you could find and contact the owner of that particular pet?
I have thought about expanding the pet information. So, you could add medical records, you could add pictures, you can add that stuff to the app. I did not look into expanding it into being more like a Nextdoor or a GPS tracker type, ID type finding system. I think there's enough other platforms in place that people use more regularly. If somebody that doesn't have a pet or somebody that's not following this app finds a dog, I don't think their first thought is to jump on and find an app that the dog might be on, unless it's listed. You could put the website on the tag, of course. But at this point, I was trying to keep it a little bit simpler than that. But I can see the advantages to that, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It's a good presentation.
Thank you.
I will have one very quick question. Does it have a notification for this task?
I'm sorry, what?
Does it have notification? For example, this task should be done on this date for responsible person. Is there any notification or?
The once I get the ability to hook up the users, so I've got that information in the database, I'd like to send out email notifications to the responsible person ahead of time, and possibly have an opt-in so that when the job has been completed, that maybe it goes out to everybody if that's what you opt into, that says, hey, Tesla just got walked. Definitely when it gets converted to a mobile app, yes, there'll be push notifications.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
And I do think that's critical. Yeah, good point.
Thank you. So it's a nice presentation. So is there any question or no? All right, thanks. So the next presenter will be Patrick Cassiday. Patrick, could you go to the next?
One second. Mac is doing some strange things where it's making me want to authenticate real quickly to share, even though I've done this before. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes. Yes.
All right. I'm gonna go ahead and play this. Okay, is your entire screen my PowerPoint currently? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm just gonna set a quick timer for myself and let's get this going. So I'm gonna do my presentation on producing predictive models of literacy based off of physical and electronic access to literature. Agenda, exactly like the template. I thought really long and hard about what my problem statement actually was, like really trying to get into the core of what actually I was attempting to measure in this project. And I got it down to two questions, like specifically, what exactly is access to literate materials? Like what does that entail? And then what impact, if any, does access to literature have on proficiency? And part of the reason why I went over that is the cost to low literacy. The data that I have up here actually came from the PIAAC, which do adult literacy level assessments as part of the OECD assessments that they do all the time since the 90s. And for people who did not have a known cognitive difficulty that basically made it to where they were never going to be exceptionally literate at no fault of their own, they still found in their 2020 data about 43 million adults that were reading at a level 1 or below as measured by them, which you can see all the pictures to the right of the slide. Those are example of 6th grade level books that those 43 million adults wouldn't be capable of reading. And if you were able to take those 43 million and make them be able to read something like The Outsiders, it would, on the low end, save hundreds of billions, on the high end, a couple trillion worth of dollars in money. And this data came out actually before the 2022. The NAEP presented their long-term trends report, that's where they measure 9-year-old kids to get an idea of how well education's going in the country. And they found over the course of COVID, there was a 7-point decrease in reading and a 5-point decrease in math. And it's the first time since they started doing those assessments where they've actually seen a decrease in math. So these numbers actually may be lowballing for what we're going to be dealing with in a few decades. I had to cut out a lot of the background because there's a lot that goes into literacy and literacy assessments and impact studies in general. So I wanted to get it to just the parts you need to understand the terms that I'm using. And this goes into a lot of Dr. Miller's work. And these are those 4 factors that you need to consider, which is access to literate materials, proficiency to be able to use those materials, the prevalence of alternative activities, and the kind of cultural support around doing literate things. And those 4 factors went together to describe how he would rank areas in their literate practices. So just keep those 4 factors in mind. It'll come up when we go over my approach. And then here's his book. I recommend it. I learned a lot. Now, going a little bit off of Miller's work, there was another researcher that I cited a lot called, her name was Newman. And these metrics right here go into her 2020 paper, which was going over, it's kind of like an assessment over some of the book distribution studies that she had done. And you get these 4 metrics of access. You have physical access, which is pretty simple. You're looking at bookstores, hobby stores, libraries, physical establishments. Electronic access, you're going into internet access, access to an e-reader, something that can use the internet. Cognitive and psychological access bleed a little bit into the culture aspect brought up by Miller, but the way she described it is cognitive access is more like having age-appropriate books, which we can measure by looking at the relative size and holdings of a physical establishment. And then psychological access is kind of that parental support around reading that becomes really important for that, that early access into reading. So now we're going to go into the approach. So remember these 4 factors that we looked at earlier? Well, proficiency, we're going to choose to use SAT reading and writing scores. Whatever you may feel about standardized testing, SAT scores are still the metric that is used to see whether or not you're getting into a college or not. So we use proficiency for that. Now that leaves us with 3 unknowns. We have the impact of access, the impact of alternative activities, and the impact of culture support. I wanted to narrow the scope so that I had a chance to drill a little deeper rather than broad. So we abstract away alternatives and culture. I'm just going to call that AC and leave that in the realm of the unknown. And we're going to really focus on access, the impact of access, and how that relates to proficiency. And in order to do this, we gave us a little bit of constraints just to make sure that this was reproducible and improvable. But we restricted ourselves to open access data. And then as far as the reproducibility and the provability of it, we actually Dockerized this entire project, and we'll go over that here in a slide or 2. This is a observational and descriptive study. So we are not going to be able to make any causal inferences because we're not implementing a treatment to be compared against a control group. And then, as previously stated, we drilled in a little bit or as much as possible into what access actually is. And so we would observe it, describe it, and then validate it. Now, in order to actually describe and validate it, we did a combination of regression analysis, which included both simple linear regressions as well as multivariate regressions. And then we attempted to validate using a walk-forward validation. If you're not familiar with walk-forward validation, basically that goes into how you do your trained test splits. Instead of taking a random amount out of your whole sample, you're taking it up to a particular year and then testing it on the next year. It goes into forecasting. This just goes into how we reproduce the project. I just pulled a base image off of the Rocker project, which is a bunch of Docker images that have RStudio and a couple other things installed upon them. Did my analysis in an EC2 instance because I have a cheap computer, and then built a Docker image that has all of my data sets, my R scripts, all of my visuals. You could reproduce the project and improve upon just pulling a Docker image, which is named there. Here's just some helpful links on where I got the data, even though you can just get the data off the image. The 2 that I really focused on is actually the Census Bureau and the NCES, is where I got majority of my data. We did do some specific to Washington State because I did a little semi-case study looking into Washington at the county level. And then I got some NTIA internet access data in addition to the stuff I got off the Census Bureau. Here's just a little bit more information on how we described these different avenues of access. For physical access, I want to highlight the hobby stores because it turns out that Barnes & Noble is actually a hobby store, not a bookstore. So I had to factor in hobby stores in addition to bookstores, as well as library data. And I used the target population of the under 18 population, so per capita of that. Same thing for computer and broadband access. Cognitive access, we kind of were able to get to, but it was difficult for us to because we couldn't find a good multiplier to factor in relative holding sizes in order to augment the number of establishments. So we kind of hit at it by doing it per capita rather than just sheer number of establishments. And then we used adult education attainment as a rough metric for psychological access, taking the assumption that a college-educated adult is going to care about education and is going to provide that psychological access. Now here's the rough overview of all the findings. We analyzed 3 years out of the available data, 2012, 2017, 2020. In each of those 3 years, only one of the metrics of access was actually statistically significant, and they performed at similar levels for all 3 of those years. In 2012, it was physical access, in 17 and 20, it was electronic access. They both had p-values between the 0.03 and 0.04, with the exception of 2020, which had a 0.01, and they both explained about 11% of the variance. One key point that I would like to bring up for electronic access is that for electronic access, it performed the best if I didn't filter anything. If I didn't try and filter out outliers, electronic access performed the best. Now let's go into those years and why we chose them. So the slide on my left, that shows the averages of all the different physical establishments across the country. You'll notice that my left and right limits of my data are 2012 and 2020, so I chose those years to study. And then there's a spike in 2017, which is why I chose that year. I didn't necessarily feel the need to look at 13, 14, 15, and 16 and all the other years in between these points because there's not a lot of changes going on. And that would have cost me like another 1,000 lines of code in order to repeat the same analysis for what would probably be the same results. So we stuck to those 3 years. Now, 2012 was the only year that we did a walk forward validation because as you can see here, we had a mean absolute error of 42.7. And when you're talking about making a prediction on SAT scores, that's not very useful. So we're going to have to, in the future, come up with better means of forecasting. And in addition to that, we had to filter out outliers in order to gain that statistical significance. You can see on the graph on the right, roughly what that linear model ended up looking like, as well as all colored by state. So you can see that there was a clear linear trend, and this was for 35 out of the 50 states. 2017, we had a completely different story. Physical access no longer was important, which I found incredibly surprising because of the spike in physical establishments. But in this particular point, electronic access was the only thing that had any kind of predictive value. And they performed similarly to the 2012 physical access, and I want you to key in on that 20 to 22% range of the under 18 population with access to broadband and computers. Because that same range manifested in the 2020 data. Now, something different about 2017 versus 2020 is that we were still in COVID lockdowns. And you can see here, instead of having a wide range of different access levels electronically for scores, you have that 20 to 22% has the widest range of possible scores, but anything below that point scored very poorly, and anything above that scored actually very well, which is the biggest discrepancy between access of a different type that I've seen out of any of the data. And this one actually was my best performing model out of all 3 years with a p-value of 0.017, but we're still explaining about 11% of the variance. And what this ends up translating to practically is that for every percentage increase in the under 18 population having access to broadband and a computer, you had about a 7.9 plus or minus 3.2 increase in their SAT scores. So my conclusions, I have a high confidence relationship between access and proficiency that explains 11% of the variance. What I think I am seeing, what I am concluding that I am seeing is not so much how much access you increase access and improves your score, but how much low access will negatively impact your score, because I think it's telling that only one of the metrics of access was statistically significant in any of those 3 years, like even right down to in 2012, when physical access was statistically significant, I actually broke down physical access and looked for any individual, like bookstore, hobby store, or library, and none of them were significant in themselves. They were only significant as a group. And so what I think I'm finding is that limiting factor. And then, so right now our updated view of the world is 11% of what ultimately goes into becoming proficiency is in access, and 89% is still within the individual control of school systems and people. For future work, I want to get better at forecasting this. There's some other methods I could do, like I could do a random forest, I could do a decision tree, I could even go down a deep learning algorithm, because there's hundreds of attributes in these data sets. And doing linear regressions, I wasn't able to really get the full breadth of all those different attributes to find correlations that I didn't even think about. And there may be some work to do as far as like finding ways to get culture. You could do that with a sentiment analysis by doing a social media mining, for example, or you could look at sales data for like children's books to get an idea for that psychological parental support. Here are all of my references. And now I will open it up for questions. And then just in case I have more questions, this is actually my Docker container where I have all the code in there. So I will open the floor for questions.
Any question? Yes. I think there isn't any question. Yeah.
Okay, well then I'll kill 2 minutes just going over this Docker container just to give something else, and if no one has a question.
Yeah, you have 4 minutes more, so go ahead.
Yeah, so as you can see here, I'm running a Docker container, which you can actually, right now it's in a private repository, but after completing this course, it'll go public. So what you get whenever you pull this image is you're gonna get, my paper will end up in here as well, but you'll have my R script as well as all of my data sets. So someone could take this entire project, just pull the Docker image, run it on an EC2 instance or their own computer if they have a powerful enough computer, and they can reproduce this study exactly, like right down to every line of code that I ran, how I cleaned the data, or they could add to this study, which was one of my big pet peeves of some of the literature review, is that their studies weren't very reproducible. This one is completely reproducible conveniently. And I just wanted to employ Docker because containerization is awesome.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for the presentation. So the next presenter will be Amin Elhami. Could you take the screen? And then Amin? Oh, he's right here. So I think we can, the third presenter is Amin. He is not here. So Andrea, Dan, do you have something to say or?
Did I put everyone to sleep?
I'm still here, but I'm just as audience today.
I'm still here and I enjoyed your presentation. You didn't put me to sleep at all. I think it was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I liked it too.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I think we finished the presentation. Thank you for presenting today. Thank you so much. So thank you. Bye. Yes.